I'll pass over to George English and the Mayflower.
Okay, well, many thanks for inviting me. Interestingly, I come from Kent originally, but I've been up in Scotland for 40 or so years now. So just give me one moment.
Yep.
He's not going to be tricky and get out.
Oh, gosh, how good of you all to come and see us off. And you've come all the way down from London, is that right? Wow.
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's 1620, my word, it's been a few years. I mean, I come from Nottinghamshire, was living there peacefully in our village. You know, the family had been there for generations. And we were Puritans, we were strict religious people, and we weren't too happy with the way the church was going in England. So someone said, well, why don't we leave and separate from the Church of England? So we went across to Holland, to Leiden there for about 12 years. And that was a mixed experience. I mean, they were nice people, but of course they spoke Dutch, we spoke English. The church we went to spoke French. Our kids were growing up more Dutch than English. So someone said, why don't we go across to this new world? So we've had quite a few weeks even to get here. And here we are, just about to set off in 1620. A mixture of hope and trepidation. We have no idea what's ahead of us. But hopefully the good Lord will look after us. Sorry, one moment. What? It's 2020, not 1620. But these people know if we got the other side or not. Oh, I'm sorry. Apparently it's 2020. Anyway, to set the scene. To me, this is such a human story. And like all good stories, there's a before, a during, and an after. And in fact, the before started more than 100 years beforehand. But what I'm going to do to start off with is just show you a quick video of the Mayflower journey itself to help to set the scene. So I'm now going to find out if I can share screen successfully. And if someone sees a video, if you just give me a thumbs up, then I know we're in business.
Yeah.
Yep, looking good. Good. Well, hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of the voyage and the early months over there, etc. So what I'm now going to do is a slide presentation. So screen share worked that time, so no reason why it shouldn't work this time. So you can see the screen all right, can we?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's good, good. Okay, so as I said, there's a before, during and after, and what we're going to do is start off and talk about the before. And looking at Europe in the 16th century, we know the time of Reformation. So some of Europe was the same, some was different. England and Scotland were there, France. There was no Germany then, there was just the German Empire. What we now know of as Holland and Belgium were 17 provinces of the Low Countries or Netherlands. And the most powerful country religion-wise then was Italy, because virtually the whole of Europe was Catholic, not just Catholic, but Roman Catholic, because the Pope controlled things from Rome. Spain was the most powerful country then, and during the 16th century, they went to South America, got their wealth. The Netherlands, those 17 provinces, were ruled from Spain, and that was a big factor in one of the things that happened. Now, the first of the two big events that happened that caused the Mayflower was Christopher Columbus going over and discovering the New World in 1492. Don't know how many of you know this. He was actually an Italian, but employed by the Spanish government. And he went over, and I rather like the thing when they say, when he went, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. So they just called it the New World. And that obviously was the pull, if you like, for the Pilgrims in due course. Now, I mentioned Spain. The King of Spain then was Charles V, one of the most powerful monarchs of all time. And in England, we had Henry VIII. And interestingly enough, both countries basically had two monarchs for the whole of the century. Spain, Charles was followed by his son, Philip II. Henry VIII, as we know, was followed in due course by Elizabeth, but in between were Edward and Mary. So the second big event that affected the separatists was 1517. Martin Luther nails up 90 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, protesting about some of the Catholic practices. For instance, if you're a naughty boy or girl, what you could do, you could say you were sorry, say a few Hail Marys, pay £50, and you get an indulgence, which allowed you to get back into the kingdom of heaven. And he didn't think these and other practices were very good. So he protested about that. Had a big influence. Even more so was probably John Calvin, who set himself up down in Geneva in Switzerland, and gradually their ideas spread throughout Europe. And basically the South stayed Catholic, Spain and Italy. Many northern countries went Protestant. England changed, nothing really to do with religion, but because the king wanted to get rid of his wife. Now, what fascinates you, when you read a novel and you say, that's a bit far-fetched, well, the thing's a bit far-fetched about this. Henry VIII's wife was Catherine of Aragon, who was the aunt of Charles V. And that upset Charles V. And Henry did a couple of other things that upset him too. Anyway, move on to the second half of the century. Philip II has now succeeded his father in Spain. Elizabeth has taken over in England. And before her, there was Queen Mary, who'd taken England back to being Catholic. Been a lot of bloodshed. Elizabeth tried to steer a middle path, not too extreme, to stop this constant Protestant Catholic thing. And that was a factor in the separatist, which we'll talk about in a moment. And essentially, the separatists weren't just from England. They weren't just from the Midlands. They were from Nottinghamshire. There were two congregations in the northern part of Nottinghamshire that eventually got to the point they said, we want to separate from the Church of England, hence the expression separatists. And as I mentioned earlier, they went across to Holland. Leiden was the second biggest city in Holland then, and 1608 spent a dozen years there. And finally, 1620, get on the Mayflower for the voyage over there. The reason we're talking about it this year in particular is it's the 400th anniversary of that event. Now let's look at the what was happening then. There's Henry VIII in England, married to Catherine of Aragon, aunt of Charles V. 1534, he split from Rome to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Ironic that in a couple of years he's beheaded her, but that's another story. Now, I mentioned the Spanish Netherlands, the Low Countries. They reckon the Spanish killed 50 to 100,000 people. So these Protestants fled, and a lot of the refugees came over to England, and Henry allowed them to stay. Eventually, he did have a son. He's succeeded by Edward, who, of course, is very young. He's only aged 9 when he takes over. So protectors ruled the country. And with these refugees, of course, they spoke Dutch and French. So in 1550, they set up the first of the strangers' churches with services in their own language. Edward dies only age 15, so Mary takes over, takes England back to being Catholic. Now, another twist, she marries Philip II of Spain. And if she'd lived, he might have become King of England. But she died fairly soon after, and Elizabeth takes over, Queen for almost 50 years. And as I said, she tried to steer a middle way. Now, another big event then was the Spanish Armada sent by Philip II. If that succeeded, history would have been very different. And again, perhaps Philip would have become king, but he didn't. Now, finally, the King of Scotland becomes King of England, James of Scotland, James I here. And he banned private religious meetings. That was the catalyst for the separatists deciding they needed to go elsewhere. We all know about the Gunpowder Plot. That was 1605, Catholic plot. Again, religion was a very, very big and important factor in those days. So let's look at the separatists. From the 1580s, these were Puritan, strict religious people. The ideas of separating came up. And here's a wee map of where they came from. Two congregations, Scrooby. Gainsborough is in fact just over into Lincolnshire. Now, various other places there have a significance. Either people were born there. Various people. Clifton was a very powerful preacher down in Babworth. I'll say a bit more about Bradford, Brewster, and Robertson in a minute. And these two congregations met in secret. James banned that. So in 1606, they separated from the Church of England. 1607, they went to Boston in Lincolnshire to get a ship to go over to Holland. They were betrayed and captured. Anyway, they succeeded the next year in getting across to, firstly, Amsterdam. Now, William Brewster, he was born there in Scrooby. He lived at Scrooby Manor. He allowed that congregation to meet in secret at Scrooby Manor. He went across to Holland, and he did go across to America. The pastor was John Robinson. Now, he'd been down in Norwich, where there were both Dutch and French refugees, strangers' churches. So he would have met Dutch people there. His ideas didn't agree with the church, so he was removed from office. He was from Scrooby originally, came back, and he became their pastor. He took them across to Holland, but he in fact stayed there, and he died there in 1625. William Bradford, you can see, born 1590, so he's just a teenager when all of these things are starting to kick off. He was an orphan. He went to Holland and to New England, and he became governor for many years. And he wrote this of Plymouth Plantation, which is the reason we know as much as we do about what actually happened with the Pilgrims. So they get across to Holland. Now, in 1581, those provinces we now know of as Holland had declared independence from the Spanish and gradually become a more peaceful place, and hence the separatists could think about going there. And other religious people followed in the years after that. But they suffered hardship. They got jobs but were poorly paid. Strange land, they spoke Dutch, not English. Another war was looming. So eventually the saints decided to go to New England. Now, I use that expression because actually on the ship, the Mayflower, only about half of the people were religious people. They're referred to as the saints. There's another group called the strangers, which I'll talk about in a moment. And they didn't leave on the Mayflower. They left Holland on another ship called the Speedwell. And again, I'll talk about that. So they talk about Mayflower, the voyage that made a nation. Let's look at what was happening in New England at this time. So basically, after Columbus discovered America, various countries tried to explore there, Spain and Holland, as well as England. Sir Walter Raleigh, we all know about, 1580, he was in Roanoke. He brought back a staple part of the Scottish diet, the chup and tobacco, but that failed. 1606, King James gave permission for colonies to be set up over there. You may have seen a couple of years ago, there was a very interesting series on television, Jamestown, 1607. Only 20% survived. So in 1620, there had been no successful colonization in America. So that was a sobering thought, if you like. So here's the actual journey. So here we are. We've got the separatists over in Holland. Now, what's been fascinating these last couple of months, the voyages had actually started. So 1st of August, the Pilgrims left Holland. The Mayflower actually came from London, and they liaised down in Southampton for a few days, set off in mid-August. But the Pilgrims must have met a second-hand boat salesman because the speedwell leaked like a sieve on the way over to Southampton. They set off, it leaked like a sieve. They went into Dartmouth for more repairs. They actually got out something like 300 miles beyond Land's End before they came back to Plymouth. Now, the reason there were two ships was, of course, this cost money. The Pilgrims didn't have much money to finance the thing. They had a company of merchant adventurers based in London who saw this as an economic opportunity. Things would be sent back from New England, which would be of value. Beaver skins were very popular then, so that was one thing they hoped would happen. So they financed it, and half of the passengers were strangers, either financed by the merchant adventurer or people themselves who were going for other reasons. So anyway, they come back to Plymouth. They left the speedwell behind. The speedwell, of course, had mainly the religious people on. About half of them got crammed onto the Mayflower. About half got left behind. Now, by this time, it's mid-September. If you were planning to go over to a new place with no housing, you'd plan to get there in spring, early summer, so you could build houses, get set up before the winter came on. They're leaving almost exactly 6 months wrong time. And that was a big factor in this journey. You saw the video earlier on. They're mainly stuck on the lower deck with the seating height's only about 5 feet. You can't stand up. They, of course, meet storms in the winter. They're actually going into the trade winds and the Gulf Stream. 66 days. The average speed is 2 miles an hour, half of our walking speed. On that ship for more than 2 months, those conditions, seatings, and finally, on the 19th of November, they see land at Cape Cod, but it's 200 miles north of where they were supposed to be. Now, you can just imagine the tensions there must have been on that. There's two groups of people, religious and non-religious. They're in a place where they're not supposed to be. So some people say we can't land here, others say we can. But finally, someone says, look, we've got to live together. We need a way, an agreement on how we're going to do that. So they drew up this document called the Mayflower Compact. And pick out some wordings there. We'll combine ourselves into a civil body, politic, to enact laws and so forth, as from time to time shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. So we're not going to have a king, we're not going to have a president, we're going to do this for ourselves and together. Seen very much as a key democratic document, probably one of the first. And it led to it becoming very much of a haven for religious people to come over. So there they are, they land. Of course, they start exploring, but winter hits very quickly. They elected John Carver as their first governor. He dies in the spring. And then William Bradford, who I mentioned earlier, he would take over for much of the next 30 years. Now, of course, they've got some information. Previous migrants have been there. They had ideas where to get food from the fields and forests. There were fish. Now, there were also some people living there, native Indians. And in early December, there was an attack with arrows by those natives. Didn't come to anything. But the tribe there were called the Wampanoag. Now, it's ironic in these days of COVID-19, they had had 3 years of plague, the Great Dying, wiped out whole villages. Christmas Day, the Pilgrims walked around the corner and there was an abandoned village. There was housing for them, a stroke of luck. But on the other hand, they too got disease going. Half of them died in that first winter. Terrible. Another piece of luck, one day they're sitting there, into camp walks this Indian who speaks English, Squanto, and the reason he spoke English was he had been captured as a slave, taken across to England, where he'd learned English, and eventually made his way back. So they had a means of communicating between the Wampanoag Indians and the Pilgrims, and they drew up a treaty between them. And that was very helpful. And of course, the Indians knew the land there and so on. So they said, okay, if you're going to be planting corn, you need fertilizer, use dead fish. And I don't know if any of you are agriculturalists, but here is what the soil's like over there, as opposed to in England where the Pilgrims came from. Now here's a sobering picture. Half of them died in that first year. And this thing, those in black are the ones who survived, and those are the others. So some families, the whole family survived. Sometimes the whole family died in that first year. And others, it was a mixture. I mean, a dreadful journey and then a dreadful few months as well. Now, one of the things I've been doing in these talks is to try and pick out the Pilgrims who came from closest to where I'm talking. So you're quite near London. The Mayflower actually left from London. The financiers were actually, of course, the merchant adventurers, who, of course, were based in the city of London. Here's a map. And the family that actually came closest to where you are is the Hopkins family. Now, there we are, quite a big family with servants as well. So Stephen Hopkins was actually from Hampshire. He married Elizabeth in Whitechapel. Their son Damaris was born, and there was one child born on the actual voyage. It was their son, called Oceanus, for obvious reasons. Edward Leicester was a servant, and all 8 of them survived. They're the only family of that size, including servants, who all survived. Great news, eh? Now, I had an ancestor on the Mayflower, Richard Warren. Now, if you knew me better, you know what a natty dresser I am, and you can immediately see where I got that from. And you may know, over a bit, they've recreated this Plymouth plantation, and they have actors playing the Pilgrims. So I met my ancestor. It was bizarre. I had so much to say to him, but he knew nothing after 1627. Anyway, he had married. He had 5 young daughters. He left them behind, not knowing if he'd get across there or he'd ever see them again. In fact, it worked out quite well because he survived. They came over 5 years later and had another couple of sons and had lots of descendants. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have been across to America and know that if you're American, you like to be descended from the Mayflower. So I run my own family history service, but without any of my expertise, all I did was went online and found I've got some quite well-known, very distant relatives, such as Henry Longfellow, the poet. 2 American presidents, Ulysses Grant and Roosevelt, are very distant cousins of mine. Ernest Hemingway, the writer. Orson Welles, the film producer. Alan Shepard, the astronaut. Richard Gere. Now, the fact he got the looks and I didn't, I personally think is very unfair, but I can't do that. Now, of course, the kids aren't interested in this stuff, but of late I've got some real street cred because someone called Taylor Swift is also, now you won't have heard of her but she's quite a popular pop star, I'm told. And certainly the youngsters actually have heard of her. Anyway, a bit of fun, but it's of course, the Americans, it's great if I'm descended from. So now what's interesting, Thanksgiving Day, you probably know this, the very first one was autumn 1621, literally to give thanks for the harvest, but for survival. Something I hadn't realized was there were 90 native Indians at that first meal, 90 Wampanoag. So it showed the initial partnership went very well. 1863, Abraham Lincoln proclaims National Day of Thanksgiving, now the 4th Thursday in November. And I rather like this. Americans gather for a day of feasting, football, and family. And so gradually they set up that they build their houses. Another ship comes out in 1621, another 2 in 1623. When they divide the land up, the acres between the various people who are there. 1626, they essentially buy out the adventurers who'd funded the trip. They actually took cows across. Not on the Mayflower, other cattle across. There was literally one cattle between 10 people, I think, but they divided up. And so gradually the Great Migration takes off. More and more people come over. And eventually there are 13 colonies on the east coast of what we now know as America. And so we have a look at this. Color coding here. Pink is where the people got to before 1660. Yellow, 1700. Green, 1760. So up to just about the War of Independence and so on. 13 colonies, very much a place of religious freedom. People came from various countries. Trade and commerce developed, not just potatoes, tobacco, cotton, and so on and so forth. And it's been called the most influential journey in Western history. We can debate that, but we've seen what's happened in the 400 years since then. Okay, so that sort of sets the scene. Just to wind up, of course, there were all sorts of celebrations planned. They actually started at the end of last year, and clearly each place the Pilgrims were in, Nottinghamshire and Boston, had things. All of the places where the voyage took place. The early ones took place, but obviously from March have been affected. There have been some very good TV and radio programs. Dan Snow had one a couple of months ago. And of course, Leiden and America also had plans. Now, if you were around in the 1950s, you may remember the Mayflower 2. We built the Mayflower 2, mainly in thanks to the Americans for involvement in World War II. Now, that's been in Plymouth for all that time since, but the last 3 years, it's had a major refit in Connecticut. A couple of months ago, it sailed round under full sail back to Plymouth. And you go on the internet, there's some very little video things. It's a lovely sight just seeing it going. So, thanks very much. That sets the scene for that and so forth. I mentioned I do have my own family history service. In fact, I think there's talk of me coming back. Very happy to do that. I've been making videos of late if you want to look at that, but have a look online. I give a 10% discount for Rotary members. So thanks for listening. Very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for that, George.